Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, that's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. There the motto is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like the Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, this week, can eliminating sales tax exemptions in Kansas generate a pot of gold? Well, a lot of people think there's a problem in Kansas, that problem being the state does not have enough money to spend. Certainly the legislature and the governor thought that way this year because they raised taxes to give the government more money to spend. Now, some people are turning to what seems like a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, that being the numerous sales tax exemptions embodied in Kansas law. Now, the advocates of eliminating these sales tax exemptions point to the great amount of revenue that could be raised if we simply eliminated these exemptions. It's estimated at about $5.9 billion, that's with the B, dollars per year. But when we look at the nature of the exemptions and the amounts of money involved, well, we have to realize that the additional tax revenue that could be raised is much less than what is claimed. Well, that is, unless Kansas was to adopt a severely uncompetitive and, in some cases, unproductive and harshly regressive tax policy. Now, a recent advocate for eliminating some sales tax exemptions in Kansas is Philip Brownlee of the Wichita Eagle editorial board. In a previous op-ed on this topic, he wrote, "With each added exemption, the state is losing out on more revenue, $5.9 billion this fiscal year, according to the Kansas Department of Revenue. That's money the state could be using to cover its budget shortfalls, increase funding to public schools, or further reduce its income tax rates." Well, at least he mentioned reducing other tax rates, because usually advocates of closing sales tax exemptions simply want more tax money to spend. Now, $5.9 billion, by the way, is a lot of money. It's almost as much as the state's general fund spending. But we need to look at the nature of these exemptions. Now, at wichitaliberty.org, I've prepared a simplified table based upon data from the Kansas Department of Revenue. I simplified because there are many deductions that should be eliminated, but they represent very small amounts of money. So I consolidated them so that we can focus on the really big picture. Now, some of these sales tax exemptions are for categories of business activity that should not be taxed, at least if we want to constrain the state to a retail sales tax only. An example is an exemption titled "Property which becomes an ingredient or component part of property or services produced or manufactured for ultimate sale at retail." Now, if that tax was collected in the state of Kansas, well, they say it would be worth another $3.08 billion to the state. That is a lot of money. It's almost as much as the state spent on public schools last year. And presently, the state collects about $2.5 billion in sales taxes. So eliminating this exemption has the potential to more than double the sales tax revenue flowing to the state. Well, at least that's what some people say. But this exemption really isn't an exemption, at least if the sales tax is a retail sales tax designed to be levied as the final tax on consumption. That's because the goods that we're talking about in this category are not being sold at retail. They're sold to manufacturers who use them as inputs to products that, when finished, will then be sold at retail. So an example in Wichita is the many small companies that supply airplane parts to companies like Cessna. These supplier companies do not collect sales tax on the parts they sell to Cessna because they are component parts of something larger that will eventually be sold at retail. And most states do not tax this type of sales. So if Kansas decided to tax these transactions, well, that would place our state's manufacturers at a severe disadvantage compared to almost all other states. And there are two other sales tax exemptions that fall into this category of inputs to production processes, totaling another $632 million. There's another similar exemption, machinery and equipment used directly in the manufacture or assemblage, blah, blah, blah. It goes on for a while there, but really it's more of the inputs to production processes at a value of $159 million. Together, these exemptions so far add up to about $3.8 billion of the $5.9 billion in total exemptions that the spenders would like to have. Well, another big dollar exemption is items already taxed, such as motor fuel, gasoline. This is an estimated $318 million loss in revenue. But do we really want to add more tax to gasoline? And other categories of exemptions are purchases made by government or purchases made by contractors on behalf of government. Together, those account for $625 million in lost revenue. But if these two exemptions were eliminated, the government would simply be taxing itself at no net benefit or gain. Well, in Kansas, there is no sales tax on prescription drugs, which means lost revenue estimated at $96 million. If the state were to start taxing residential and agricultural use utilities, it could gain an estimated $170 million. But these taxes, like the sales tax on food and the motor fuel tax, they fall hardest on low-income families. And as Kansas is one of the very few states to tax food, well, do we want to make life even more difficult for low-income households? Adding up all these exemptions come to a little more than $5 billion. And there are some other exemptions for which we could make similar arguments for their retention. And then what's left over? These are the exemptions that really should not exist. Well, it doesn't amount to much money at all. The entire category of exemptions to charitable organizations by name, well, that amounts to about $3 million in exempted sales tax. These represent the organizations where a lawmaker has crafted an exemption like property and services purchased by Jazz in the Woods and sales made by or on behalf of such organization. Yeah, that's right. Someone asked for a special dispensation and the legislature granted it. Now, this is not an exemption granted to a category of organizations that are in a similar situation. It is an exemption carved out solely for the benefit of a single entity. So when the Wichita Eagle's Philip Brownlee writes, as is, favored groups are saving billions of dollars a year, worsening the tax burden for everyone else, well, he must be including broad categories of business, like all Kansas manufacturing companies as one of these favored groups. Or maybe he means prescription drug users are a favored group, or families struggling to pay utility bills. But there are even more problems with this op-ed. Philip Brownlee describes the sales tax exemption as a cost in lost revenue. Now, the only way this makes sense is that if one thinks that our property, our money that is, well, that first belongs to the state, and that in order to spend any of it, well, we have to give the state its share, give the governor his cut. That's an opinion, an ideology, if you will, that you may agree with or you may oppose. But what's remarkable is that in his previous career, Philip Brownlee was a certified public accountant. He ought to understand the nature of sales taxes meant to be applied to retail sales, not components of manufactured goods. Now, when our newspapers publish editorials and articles like this, it does our state an extreme disservice. The conclusions in this editorial are not based on any reasonable interpretation of facts or economics. But it gets gullible newspaper readers charged up and excited, thinking that there's a pot of gold just waiting for the state to seize. But it just is not there. It's stuff like this that led H.L. Mencken to write, "A newspaper is a devicer making the ignorant more ignorant and the crazy crazier." But it's not only our newspapers that do things like this. A recent press release from the office of Kansas Governor Sam Brownback quoted the governor proclaiming this: "Agriculture is our largest economic driver, bringing more than $63 billion into the Kansas economy." Now, $63 billion is a lot of output. That would be about 43% of the entire Kansas economy. So, does agriculture really account for almost half of the economic output of Kansas? Well, a document supplied by the Kansas Department of Agriculture provides more detail and explains how such a large number is obtained. It includes three components explained as direct, indirect, and induced effects, which sum together to estimate the total economic contribution in the state. It goes on to say that direct effects capture the contribution from agricultural and food products. Indirect effects capture the economic benefit from farms and agricultural businesses purchasing inputs from the supporting industries within the state. And induced effects capture the benefits created when employees of farms, agricultural businesses, and the supporting industries spend their wages on goods and services within the state. Now, this method of reckoning economic impact is from a model called M-Plan. This is a proprietary system with methodology and assumptions that are not open to inspection. An M-Plan is often used by those who are asking government for money or tax breaks. An M-Plan comes up with some real whoppers as to how important an industry is to the economy. When shown these figures, government officials are usually swayed to grant incentives. But there's a problem. Agriculture cannot possibly be responsible for 43% of Kansas' gross domestic product. The United States Bureau of Economic Analysis has figures for each state showing the contribution to GDP for industry categories. And I've gathered the data and calculated percentages for each industry. You can see all this at wichitaliberty.org. And the category of agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting accounts for, according to this Bureau of Economic Analysis, accounts for 5.5% of Kansas GDP, which is a long, long way from the governor's claim of 43%. And there are 7 other industry categories that rank above agriculture in total output. Now, it's true that the title of the paper is Estimated Economic Output or Economic Impact of Agricultural, Food, and Food Processing Sectors. So if we add in other subsectors such as food and beverage and tobacco products manufacturing and food services and drinking places, if we add those to agriculture, we end up with production worth 9.8% of Kansas GDP. And that is being overly generous to agriculture. It counts all bars and restaurants as part of the agricultural industry, something that makes no sense. So how do we take these numbers and pump them up to 43% of the economy like the governor says? Well, M-Plan, that's how. Now, it's true that when an industry causes economic activity to occur, it spawns other economic activity. These are the indirect and induced effects that M-Plan produces. But these numbers are hugely inflated. And when we take all industries, we find that economic activity is counted way more than just one time. Because recall, there are 7 industry categories ranking above agriculture in importance. And when it suits its needs, each of these uses M-Plan to boost its importance to the state. Consider manufacturing, which at 13.1% of GDP is the third largest industry in Kansas. When manufacturing companies appeal to the state or local government for subsidies, they use M-Plan or related mechanisms to inflate their importance. Almost everyone does this. It's pretty much standard procedure. Except when everyone claims the same indirect and induced economic activity, such analysis becomes meaningless. If we added up the M-Plan calculated value of each industry to the Kansas economy, we'd end up with a value several times larger than the actual value. But this is what the Kansas Department of Agriculture and Governor Sam Brownback have done. We expect this behavior from companies or local economic development agencies when they appeal for economic development incentives. They need to inflate their importance to gullible government bureaucrats and elected officials. But Governor Brownback doesn't need to do this, and neither does the Kansas Department of Agriculture. From them, all we want is the truth and nothing more. There is no need for Kansas state government to exaggerate the value of agriculture to the Kansas economy. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Recently, Mark Holden spoke to the Wichita Pachyderm Club on the topic of criminal justice reform. Holden is Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Koch Industries here in Wichita. Criminal justice reform and overcriminalization are issues that Charles and David Koch have been working on for some time. It has to do with the proliferation of criminal laws, so many that the federal government admits that it cannot count them. And the Heritage Foundation has described another aspect of the problem besides the sheer number of laws. It said in many criminal laws, the guilty mind requirement has been removed or weakened. This means people can go to prison regardless of whether they intended to break the law or if they knew that their actions were in violations of the law. Traditionally, crimes had two components. You had to have a guilty mind, and you also had to commit a bad act. Today, many criminal laws and regulations have insufficient or no guilty mind requirement, meaning that a person need not know that his or her conduct is illegal in order to be guilty of the crime. Here's an example. In Indiana, a police officer and his wife spotted an injured baby deer on their neighbor's porch. Instead of turning a blind eye to the dying fawn, the couple took the deer in and nursed it back to health. Well, an Indiana conservation officer spotted the fawn and promptly charged the couple with unlawful possession of the deer, which is a misdemeanor offense. Fortunately for the deer, the day it was about to be euthanized by the state, it escaped into the wild. And then, due to public outrage, the government dropped the charges. Well, earlier this year, Mark Holden and Charles Koch wrote an op-ed that described the problem of overcriminalization and criminal justice reform. They wrote, "As Americans, we like to believe the rule of law in our country is respected and fairly applied, and that only those who commit crimes of fraud or violence are punished and imprisoned. But the reality is often different. It is surprisingly easy for otherwise law-abiding citizens to run afoul of the overwhelming number of federal and state criminal laws. This proliferation is sometimes referred to as overcriminalization, which affects us all, but most profoundly harms our disadvantaged citizens. Overcriminalization," they wrote, "has led to the mass incarceration of those ensnared by our criminal justice system, even though such imprisonment does not always enhance public safety. Indeed, more than half of federal inmates are nonviolent drug offenders. Enforcing so many victimless crimes inevitably leads to conflict between our citizens and law enforcement. And as we have seen all too often, it can place our police officers in harm's way, leading to tragic consequences for all involved. And later on in the op-ed, Charles Koch and Mark Holden wrote, "We have paid a heavy price for mass incarceration and could benefit by reversing this trend. It has been estimated that at least 53% of those entering prison were living at or below the U.S. poverty line when their sentence began. Incarceration leads to a 40% decrease in annual earnings, reduced job tenure, and higher unemployment. A Pew Charitable Trust study revealed that 2/3 of former inmates with earnings in the bottom fifth upon release in 1986 remained at that level or below even 20 years later. And a Villanova University study concluded that had mass incarceration not occurred, poverty would have decreased by more than 20%, or about 2.5 percentage points, and several million fewer people would have been in poverty in recent years. And African Americans, who make up around 13% of the United States population but account for almost 40% of the prison inmates, are significantly affected by these issues. According to Harvard sociologist Bruce Western, prison has become the new poverty trap. It has become a routine event for poor African American men and their families, creating an enduring disadvantage at the very bottom of American society. Reversing overcriminalization and mass incarceration will improve societal well-being in many respects, most notably by decreasing poverty. Today, approximately 50 million people, that's about 14% of the population, are at or below the United States poverty rate. Fixing our criminal justice system could reduce the overall poverty rates by as much as 30%, dramatically improving the quality of life throughout society, especially for the disadvantaged. Well, that was Mark Holden and Charles Koch writing together in Politico earlier this year. And at WichitaLiberty.org, there is a video of Holden speaking at the Wichita Pachyderm Club earlier this month on this topic. It's worth your time to view. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. In August, during the debate and public hearings concerning the Sedgwick County budget, there was a lot of talk about charity. The Commission was considering cutting funds for things like the Arts Council and not implementing a planned increase in zoo funding, for example. This generated a lot of outrage by the beneficiaries of this funding. There were endless appeals for charity. It was argued that the county government should engage in charitable giving, that it should fund the arts, the zoo, economic development programs, inefficient public health programs, the River Festival, training for future employees of Spirit Aerosystems, and so on. It seemed to me that what was missing in this debate was the meaning of charity. When government forces us to fund the Arts Council, for example, well, is that an act of charity? And what about the zoo? And should I be forced to pay to train employees for Spirit Aerosystems? It really distresses me that we don't often think about big issues like the difference between government and charity. Here's a video from Learn Liberty that illustrates this issue. Learn Liberty is a project of the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University. They have a lot of very good videos there. Many just a few minutes long, like the one I will show you right now, and these videos explain important topics that we all should be thinking about more often. Here from Learn Liberty is the video titled Charity versus Taxation. What is the difference? After watching, I hope you will be able to think differently about using taxes to fund the Arts Council, the Art Museum, the zoo, and many of the other things our government funds.
Hi, I'm Rob Gressis. I'm a professor of philosophy at California State University Northridge, where we are right now. We're doing a little philosophy experiment today. So here's the first question. Are there any causes, political, charities, anything like that, that you agree with?
Yeah, I think funding for cancer research is really good.
PETA. I would donate some money to PETA.
I like Habitat for Humanity.
Okay, Habitat
I think
for Humanity.
it's a great cause, building homes for people.
Okay, great answer. So here's another simple question. Do you think it's morally okay for you to give your own money or time to Habitat for Humanity?
Yeah, I think it's a good cause, so I wouldn't see why not.
I think so, yeah. I
It's your own money, you can
agree
do
with
with it
that,
what you
yeah.
want. So now here's another question. Is it moral to force others to give to the cause of your choice?
No.
No, okay. So we'll put it no.
Force is
Yeah.
a really harsh word.
So you said, do it or else I'll fine you.
No.
So would it be okay for you to say, stick a gun in my face and say, give money to the Red Cross or else
No.
I'll shoot you in the knee?
No.
No, okay.
No.
All right, so that's one kind of force. How about just lightly beating me up?
No.
Okay. What about just the threat of force?
No.
So why not? Why is it not okay for you to use force to get me to give my money to St. Jude?
Because you should be doing it off of your own will,
Yeah.
not because you're forced to or obligated to do so.
It's essentially extortion. I would belittle your autonomy by using force to make you do what I will.
So now let's go to the next board here. Is it moral for the government to force others to give to the cause of your choice?
No.
I think that it is morally okay to do so.
I think in some cases, yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think that's right.
So is it okay for the government ever to use force to get people to give money, like taxes or anything like that?
Well, I don't think so.
Oh,
I don't think so.
doesn't that make you like an anarchist or something?
I wanted to say yes, given what we understand government is.
Yeah.
I just couldn't say yes. I just followed my logic there and brought it over here.
So this collapse argument, it seems like it's your big thing.
Yeah.
And if you could be shown that there's a society that could work pretty well, or as well, or even better than our current society, and it had no taxes, right? Everything happened voluntarily.
Yeah.
Then you'd be on board with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think most people ever even think of this question?
No, I don't think so. I think we just low ride by it, and if more people stopped by and saw only this question, I think the tax would be filled.
Yeah, maybe it'd all be yeses.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you do this question first and this one, things change.
Yeah,
Which
definitely.
is an interesting lesson about the power of philosophy.
Yes.
So I think we're going to leave it there. So what have we learned today? Here's one thing I might want to say. It's okay for the government to use force when it's okay for you to use force. But when it's not okay for you to use force, maybe it's also not okay for the government to use force. What do you think?